Okay, so I wanted to start off with some of the materials that I think you'll need to get started with sourdough. The first of which is a jar to keep your sourdough in. Give it a lot of head space because your sourdough starter is going to be fed and rise and fall. So it needs room for that. A good kitchen scale, could be digital or analog, whatever you prefer. We have these special bowls that are great for letting the bread rise, and they're easy to flip out, which I'll show you later. A cooling rack for when your bread's all done and ready to cool. I like to mix our sourdough bread in stainless steel bowls. Here's a batch of dough that I have already started, and I keep it covered with a wet linen cloth. You'll also need something to stir your sourdough starter with. I like something long and metal. I prefer non-toxic materials, so metal or wood is always a good option for me. We actually use a steak hook as a stirrer because it can reach all the way to the bottom and get it to combine together. So you can use whatever you have, butter knife, long spoon, anything like that should work just fine. So I wanted to show you first off how to feed the starter and get started on that. The first thing you'll need is flour, and you also need water. So this is how I store my flour, but this is what it looks like from the store. It's organic, all-purpose flour from Costco. So I'm going to start out by adding in some warm water. It's about 100 degrees. It doesn't have to be 100 degrees, but just to give it a little bit of a head start so it doesn't have to warm up. So I'm starting with about 415 grams of starter, and I could typically match that with 415 of water and 415 of flour. But it's really flexible. And so I'm gonna add about 315. You can see it's 314 there. Close enough for me. It will be fed, it will do its job and give me what I need at the end of it. So I just clear out that, and then I add in my flour. So I'm just measuring out again until it gets equal parts water, flour, added back into the starter jar. I feed it in the same jar that I harvest it from. So there we go. That's about 317. Like I said, close enough. It's pretty flexible. And then I use my stirring rod. And I just reach it all the way down to the bottom, pulling it up. I could scrape the sides. I don't know if you can see that on the video, but I can scrape the sides. Just make sure I'm combining it all really well. I'll give you a look in there. So as you can see, I'm combining it all the way through, and I'm just going until it's a consistent texture inside. It's gonna need a little bit more. Should be good. That's all done. I just put a lid on, let it set. As you can see, it's on just a tiny little bit, but it doesn't have to be anything special. And I just let it sit on my counter for about 12 hours overnight if I feed it the night before. And there you go. And if I want it to rise faster, then I put it in the oven with the light on, and it will definitely feed faster. But you can keep an eye on it. You can see it started about here. With all the ingredients added, it's about here now. Once it's ready to be put into dough, it will be all the way at the top. If I overfill it, then it can even push the lid off and overflow from there. But it's living, breathing, working, and doing its thing. Okay, so now we're at the stage where I've already mixed this dough. I could show you how to put together the ingredients later, but for now I already have this dough started. I just remove the linen, and another tool I forgot to mention earlier is a tool like this. It's easy for separating bread. Mine has a rounded edge. I prefer not to use plastics in my kitchen. However, it doesn't come in contact with anything that's heated, so that's a benefit. And the plastic is a little bit more flexible than any metal that I have that's similar, and it helps me to scrape the edges of the bowl. So essentially at this point now, I'm just going to bring out the dough onto the counter. It's a clean stainless steel working surface. It doesn't have to be stainless steel, whatever surface of the counter you have. I also do it on glass or even on my glass stovetop. If you have granite countertops or stone countertops of some sort, that's fine as well. I'm gonna get my hands wet so it doesn't get as sticky, and I'll be right back. So my hands are wet, just a little rinse in the sink, and I'm gonna pick up and fold, and I roll and roll. So there's a lot of different methods to this. You can get really intricate ways of working your bread. I'm making sure I'm cleaning up after myself on the table, and you can see it stops looking as chunky, and now it's a little bit more smooth, more of like a skin-like texture. I'm stretching and strengthening the dough, and I don't want to overdo it. Once it starts to rip, that means I'm going a little bit too long. You can see this is what a rip looks like. I don't want to rip the gluten strands, so at that point, I place it back in my bowl, and I'm going to cover it again and let it rest. This dough has rested for a few hours already after I mixed it, and now I'm going to let it rest for a few more hours. And if I want it done before dinner, then I'm going to put it in my oven again with the light on so it has a warm environment to feed and grow. And then I'll work it again, and I'll work it another time while the oven is preheating. And then at the end of the day, I'll have some bread. Okay, so into my oven this goes, and I make sure I have my light set on. That's going to be enough heat to let it rise. So this is what I bake with most of the time. It's my staple in our house. We use a lot of sandwich bread. So no matter what, I usually make 2 batches worth, and I'll make one into a sandwich loaf. The other one I'll put into rolls or pull apart bread or sticks or cinnamon rolls or anything like that. But this is great for sandwich bread. What I do is I just coat the entire inside with coconut oil or butter if you have it, and I'll put the dough in here. I'll score it with a scoring knife. I forgot that as a tool as well. But you could score the top with a razor blade, and then it goes into the oven. And there's a couple tricks on getting a hard crust even with the glass, which is a great option as well. It doesn't come out as tough as it does when you bake it in something like cast iron or a Dutch oven. So there's different ways of making your bread exactly the way you want it, but I'm happy to help you find that way. When I'm scoring, I use just a traditional razor blade. This is not necessarily one made for baking. It's one that's just like a hygienic razor blade sort of thing. But there are little scoring blades with a handle, which might be easier for you. Oftentimes they come with like in a kit with something like this. And if you don't have one of these bowls, that's fine as well. I have made large batches of bread for our neighbors, and I didn't have enough Banneton bowls to do that, to do all the rising in there. So I essentially just dusted a regular dining bowl and with flour, and then I raised a bunch of different loaves all at the same time with that, and it works very similarly. Essentially, you're wanting it to be so it's not as handled. It comes with this elastic cotton linen blend cover, but there's also the option if you just dust the inside of the bowl itself. It's made so it releases and it doesn't hold the dough back. So it gets in, you dust all the cracks with the flour, and then it lets go of the dough when you're ready to roll it out. And by roll it out, I mean just flip it over so that the dough comes out. You're never gonna have to roll it with a rolling pin. And here is our recipe that I use. This is a double batch, so you can lower it as needed. The bowl that I have currently being ready to be baked is a half portion of this because I used the other half this morning for pancakes. But nonetheless, so 1,200 grams all-purpose flour, 150 grams wheat flour, 600 grams of your starter, 930 grams of purified water, and 36 grams salt. We use Himalayan pink salt, we use RO water, the starter, everything's organic in that, and then both of the flours we choose are organic as well. The wheat flour is an organic wheat flour I get from Azure. That's a store that you can order online and then do a local pickup. But you can use the wheat flour that you get from your grocery store if that's what you have available and that's what you prefer. The all-purpose flour from Costco is excellent. I've tried different all-purpose flours from different stores. They're made differently, and so your recipe might need a little bit of tweaking compared to mine. It might look a little different, and that's totally fine, but this could be a good jump off point for you to get started and know what works and what doesn't. Okay, so I'm gonna run it through with you one more time and as just a quick overview because I know it's a lot of information. I'm gonna go through it as I do when I'm making my large batch, but if you need to portion down, that's fine. So essentially I feed my starter on my kitchen digital scale. I start with about 300 grams of starter, give or take. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's a little less, but it can still do it. If it's less, it will just take a little longer to eat through the flour and water. If it's more, it will eat through the flour and water a little bit faster. So you feed it equal parts water and flour. I use my all-purpose organic flour for that. After that, I mix it into a stainless steel bowl. I do the same recipe portions that I specified earlier. Typically what I do is I put the water in first and then I stir it up to dissolve the starter into the water. It just makes it combine a little bit easier. Some people postpone adding the salt until later. I don't like to make things more complicated than they need to be. I really love my recipe and the bread's the best I've ever had. So I'm fine mixing in the salt at the same time. So I start with the starter in the bowl, add in my water, stir it up. Then I add in my flours, the white and the wheat, and then I add in the salt. And then I give that a good stir around. I just use a regular kitchen spoon, my silver stainless spoon. Stir it up. It's gonna look chunky. That's totally fine. It might be a little flaky. I just try to get it even. And then I let it sit. If it's in the winter time or fall, or it's colder in my house, I put it in the oven with the light on to sit. If it's in the summer, it's just out on my countertop with the linen. I always put that linen and I keep it wet so the linen's covering the top. After that, I'm gonna bring it back onto my countertop. I'm going to work the bread just like I showed you. You do that once over, put it back in the bowl, leave it for at least an hour and a half. And then after that, you bring it back out on your counter, you do it again, and you put it into your banneton bowls or a rising bowl. So you put it in here, let it rise for another hour and a half, 2 hours at least. You can let it go a little bit longer. I've even let it go overnight before. If you let it go overnight, you want to put it in the fridge though, so it's a slower rise and you don't let everything get eaten up and then it goes flat. So I'd say probably about 2 hours is just fine. After it rises in these bowls or in your rising bowl, however you have it, put it back out on your counter and you're preparing it to bake. So you can put it into your baking dish, whether it's a casserole dish, a Dutch oven, a sandwich loaf, anything you have that you want to bake it in, you put it in there, you let it rise again while your oven's preheating. It takes my oven a little while to get to 425. You're going to want your oven set to 425 and let it rise all the way. If you want a crispier crust, I put a cast iron pan. I have a huge cast iron pan, and I put it in the lower rack in my oven. And I preheat my oven with that in it. I want it hot, so my cast iron will get hot with the oven. And if I want that thick, crispier, not thicker, but crispier crust, then I put my bread, while it's loaded in its pan after it's rested during preheat, I put that into the oven. Then that will bake, and after I score it with the little blade, then it will bake for 20 minutes at 425. And then after that 20 minutes, I take out the cast iron. And if you want an extra crispy crust, when you put it in to bake the first time, you can add a couple ice cubes in the cast iron. So you put the ice cubes in the cast iron, it will make that crust a little bit more crisp because you have that moisture it's going to steam up and steam the outside of your bread, the crust. So that's optional. You don't have to do that. I've baked it before without the cast iron and without the ice cubes, and it comes out amazing as well, just a softer crust. So then after the 425 for 20 minutes, you take out the cast iron if it's in there. If it's not in there, doesn't matter, leave it out. Turn down your oven to 350. You're gonna want your oven at 350 for about 20 minutes is the general rule. But if you're baking a smaller loaf, if I'm baking just one single loaf like this, it's probably gonna be closer to 15 minutes. If I'm baking 3 loaves like this, or big thick loaves, it's gonna be close to 20 minutes. If I'm baking little tiny skinny breadsticks or tiny little round rolls or something like that, it might only be 10 minutes. So my suggestion is get to know your oven and your baking habits. Start with the general rule of it's going to be in the medium about 20 minutes, give or take. So maybe start with your second timer at about 10 minutes, check it. Another thing that is very helpful with bread making is a thermometer that you can stick into the bread to see the internal temperature. So I have this one, it's a Blackstone. You turn it on and you hold the button in the middle and it's measuring the temperature at the end of the stick. So I pierce it into my bread after it's baked in for the second round at 350, and I want it to be in the 170s. About 172 is perfect, in my opinion, for the internal temperature of your bread. Then when you get it out, you can let it rest on a cooling rack. I don't like to let it cool in the glass or in the cast iron because if it's in the glass, the condensation and the moisture ends up coming out and making the bottom kind of extra watery moist, not like that nice bread moist. So I put it on a cooling rack. I take it immediately out of the cast iron or the glass when it's ready to cool. And then at that point, you can cut into it right away and have some nice warm homemade bread. Some people think that's taboo and you need to let it rest for at least 10 minutes and cool down before you cut into it. My bread doesn't turn flat when I cut into it, even when it's nice and hot. So I like to do it fresh. We love fresh bread. So I hope that's really helpful to you. If you have any questions at all, I have more information to share. I don't have the bread right now to show you what has already been made, but as I move on in my day, I'll try to bring my camera out and film a little bit more if that's helpful to you. Please let me know if you have any questions.